He was in more than 100 movies over the course of more than 30 years, with more than half of them being westerns. These movies made him a lasting figure of both a wild and idealized country. Unlike the fiery John Wayne or the thoughtful Gary Cooper, Scott played the quiet cowboy, a man who didn't say much, moved quickly, and had strong morals even when he had to draw his gun. On screen and in real life, though, it was the silence that made his story such a creepy mystery. He kept to himself, did not give many interviews, never wrote a book, and was almost never seen by the public after he retired. Randolph Scott took himself out of the spotlight, making it seem like he had never lived outside of his roles. Then, many years later, a handwritten letter he left behind before he died told the world about his life's secrets. This made everyone look again. It's possible that Randolph Scott, the American horse hero, killed every bad guy on screen. In real life, though, he gave in to the cruelest social norms of his time and carried that wound with him until the end. Scott was born on January 23, 1898, but his first cry didn't happen in the town where he was born. He was born in Orange County, Virginia, while his parents were visiting family across the country. He and his 5 brothers grew up in a beautiful old house designed by the famous architect Louis H. Asbury after the family moved back to Charlotte, North Carolina. Scott's life was built on standing, prestige, and what seemed like a sure future from a very young age. In addition to being an engineer, his father, George Grant Scott, was the first certified public accountant in the state of North Carolina. He was a real leader in his field. He had a mother named Lucille Crane who was from a wealthy and powerful Southern family. At a time when many of the future stars in Hollywood came from poor families, Randolph Scott was raised in a wealthy family and was taught from birth how to live a good life. That man wasn't looking for chances, he was born to be picked. Randolph Scott went to Woodbury Forest, which is one of the best all-boys private schools in the United States. A school where the sons of the South's political, financial, and military elite were taught strict discipline, personal honor, and a strong sense of social duty. Along with doing well in school, Scott stood out for his sports skills. He rode horses, played football, baseball, and swimming, not as a sport, but because that's what it means to be a Southern gentleman. Over time, these skills became easy on screen. He didn't need to learn how to ride a horse or shoot a gun. They were already in his blood. But maybe the event that most clearly showed who he was when the United States joined World War I in 1917. Randolph Scott, who was 19 at the time, chose to join the military and joined the 2nd Trench Mortar Battalion of the 19th Field Artillery Regiment instead of waiting to be drafted. He was in charge of artillery observation just behind enemy lines on the front lines in France. A dangerous job where they had to live under sniper fire and were always at risk of being captured or killed. People think that what he went through in the war made him the man he was, quiet, tough, and in complete control of his feelings. He never talked about what he saw. Because one wrong estimate could cost lives, he learned to do math by hand and change artillery coordinates on the spot. As each second went by, he and the other soldiers held on to their dog tags, read small Bibles, and hoped that they would live to see another sunrise. Randolph Scott didn't rush home when the war was over. He stayed in France, went to school to become an artillery officer, and was then made a lieutenant. Randolph Scott still hadn't found where he fit, even though he came from a good family and had served in the military. Maybe it was during those quiet days that he thought about what he really wanted. So when he got back, he tried sports again at Georgia Tech and then went to the University of North Carolina to study textile engineering, as his family had always done. But every path he took because he knew he had to lead to the same end. Being empty. He had to give up sports because of an old illness. He felt trapped in his job as an accountant at the family business. Randolph Scott slowly turned away from the life that was supposed to be his and into a world full of unknowns. Los Angeles. No one could have known that a Southern aristocrat with a soft voice, the body of an officer, and a heart that had been scarred by war would become the best horse actor in American history. Back in the late 1920s, Hollywood was a battlefield covered in gold. Everybody wants to be seen, but not everyone gets called. One guy stood out from the crowd. He was 6'3" and had the posture of a soldier and the soft drawl of a Southern gentleman. Since Randolph Scott was different from everyone else, he didn't have to yell to be seen. In 1928, chance came up during a bad golf game at the Los Angeles Country Club. By chance, Randolph Scott was paired with Howard Hughes, a famous director and millionaire. They played 18 rounds together. Hughes didn't just remember Scott's swing by the end. He was impressed by how calm he was and how rare his appearance was in movies. Everything changed because of a small invitation and an unnamed supporting part. Sharpshooters, which came out in 1928, was the first movie Hughes made after hearing that Hollywood needs more looks like his. However, looks were not enough. It was clear to Randolph Scott. It wasn't enough for him to look good. Right away, he started taking acting classes at the Pasadena Playhouse, which was known at the time as one of the toughest places to train actors and later produced players like Dustin Hoffman and Gene Hackman. More than anything else, he learned how to be patient. He learned how to control his voice, his body language, and his feelings. Randolph Scott kept getting nameless, voiceless background parts all through the early 1930s. Sometimes he was just on the edge of the frame. Even though he wasn't given credit in The Virginian in 1929, he still left a mark. He taught Gary Cooper how to speak with a Southern accent, which made the role seem more real. People in Hollywood started to say for the first time, that guy's not just background. That hard work paid off in the end. Randolph Scott was cast as the lead in the stage production by Paramount Pictures under a moonlit Virginia sky. On the first night of the show, a talent agent was in the crowd and took note. Then there was an official studio contract. Hollywood's doors were open, but not for a quiet walk-on this time. In 1932, he got his first lead role in Henry Hathaway's Heritage of the Desert. The movie didn't do very well at the box office, but it did prove one thing. Randy Scott was now well on his way to becoming a real Western star. In the same year, he was in Hot Saturday with Cary Grant, who wasn't very well known at the time. They played rivals in a relationship for the same woman, but they became close friends off-screen and finally moved in together. Later, their relationship would send shockwaves through Hollywood. But at the time, it was just two lonely men trying to find their place in a world that was both bright and cold. Randy Scott's early work was not at all a smooth ride. He tried his hand at horror movies like Unnatural in 1933, romantic comedies like The Notebook, and even musicals like Roberta with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers in 1935. But no matter what kind of music he was playing, he had the quiet seriousness of someone who had been through war. He was always calm and honest, never showy. However, Scott quickly learned that Broadway stages and musical sets were not his true home. He was meant to wear leather, wear a wide-brimmed hat, and ride a horse in a shady place. He would start to become famous for his work along that path, the road of the cowboy. It took Randolph Scott a long time to become a star. He didn't have a big break when he was young like a lot of artists did. Like the characters he played, his work was a steady, quiet build-up. He wasn't flashy or rushed, but he still got to the top by being honest. In his early years, Scott tried his hand at comedy, horror, and plays, but as time went on, he slowly moved toward the American West, which was where he truly belonged. From the late 1930s on, he started to choose cowboy parts as a way to deeply connect with who he was. Not only did he play in westerns, he made them his own world, one where heroes didn't need many words, just a strong back and a promise kept. People in America got their ideas for the Randolph Scott cowboy from movies like Jesse James, 1939, The Last of the Mohicans, 1936, Colt 45, 1950, Gunfighters, 1947, The Walking Hills, 1949, and Trail Street, 1947. He was tall, calm, and ethically strong, but his eyes never really looked at peace. He and producer Harry Joe Brown started Renown Productions in 1946. The name comes from Randolph and Brown. This was a smart move that kept Scott from being tied down by big companies. He was no longer stuck in a certain role and could pick his own plots, co-stars, and directors. He made a new kind of cowboy with that power. Not all strong, full of regrets, and hiding a dark side that they don't talk about. The best work of this time was when he worked with director Bud B. Taker on 7 movies from 1956 to 1960. These movies are called the Renown Cycle. These weren't big, flashy shows. The West wasn't romanticized, there were no special effects, and the background wasn't very big. The tone of these movies was more like simple songs about being alone, making sacrifices, and the price of honor. In the 1956 movie 7 Men From Now, Scott played a guy who was sad because his wife had been killed in a robbery. Because he feels guilty, he goes after the thieves not to get justice but to punish himself. Every step forward makes the blame stick more. Lee Marvin, a beautiful and smart criminal who stands next to him, represents the darker side of Scott's own soul. The movie doesn't end with victory, instead, it shows that getting payback doesn't bring peace. The 1957 Tall T went even further the next year. Scott played Pat Brennan, a guy who was held hostage by a group of criminals along with a stranger. People weren't scared by the shootouts. It was the moral choice between living or dying, making a sacrifice or keeping true to one's values. In a memorable scene, Brennan tricks a cow with a piece of candy. It's a simple act that shows who he really is, understanding, not force. Then came Ride Lonesome, 1959, which was one of the saddest parts of his career. Scott played a bounty hunter named Ben Brigade who caught a killer. Not for the prize, but to find the killer's brother, who killed his own wife and hung her from a tree. In the last scene, he burns down the tree where his wife was killed. This ends the chase and helps him forgive himself. All of those jobs had one thing in common. The heroes in Randolph Scott's stories lost hope that they could save the world. They were just trying to live properly in a world that was already going bad. In the silence, they turned into the most complicated characters the Western genre had ever seen. Scott decided to make his last movie, Ride the High Country, with Sam Peckinpah in charge in 1962. The story was about two old police officers, one who was greedy and the other who was still true to his beliefs, who were on their last gold transport. Scott played Gil Westrom, a man who was torn between duty and desire. He doesn't win or save anyone at the end of the movie. But he picks the right time to leave a world that is falling apart. After filming was over, Randolph Scott stated that he was leaving acting. There was no party, honors, or goodbye gala. The man knew what he had to say and left, just like the cowboys he played. Without making a sound or looking back, and without asking for praise. Randolph Scott is shown on TV. He was the perfect man, strong, calm, and always ready to guard the weak woman. But he never really had a public relationship. He was never able to love the way he really wanted to, and that may have been the saddest thing in his life. Randolph Scott got married for the first time in 1936, but not to another star of the time. Instead, he married Marion DuPont Somerville, a wealthy East Coast woman with no ties to the movie business. She was the granddaughter of the founder of the DuPont Company and the daughter of a wealthy family in Virginia. She was also known as America's Queen of Horse Racing. On paper, it seemed like a great match. A rising Western movie star and a real-life queen, a Western hero and an Eastern icon. Both of them were successful, well-liked, and living very different lives. The mismatch was clear from the start. Marion did not move to Hollywood. It was still her home, Montpelier Estate, a 55-room mansion in the Virginia woods that had once been President James Madison's home. Randolph Scott, whose work was going great, stayed busy on sets all over California. They were separated by the whole of America and a gap that was hard to cross. Marion still wanted to help her husband even though they were no longer together. She built a gym in the basement for him to use when he came to visit. But Randolph Scott was 6 feet 4 inches tall, so Marion dug the floor deeper to make a gym pit where he could stand up and lift weights. It was a lovely and strangely specific thing to do. A picture of a relationship that wanted to be close but couldn't quite get there. They didn't show up together at many public events, and magazines didn't have any loving pictures or words about them. When Marion's beloved horse Battleship won the Grand National in England in 1938, she didn't go to New York to celebrate with her friends and family. She had Randolph Scott fill in for her. Husband who wasn't there much, now an unhappy witness to a victory that wasn't his. After 3 years of marriage, they split up in 1939. There was no blame, no litigation, and no scandal. There was just an easy explanation. Our homes were too far apart. That was the only thing Randolph Scott ever said about the marriage. But one small thing stays with you long enough to make you think. Marion used the name Scott all the time. She kept it until her death in 1983, which was 40 years after they broke up. It wasn't for fame. She was more important than he ever was in high society. Maybe it was a quiet way to say goodbye or show respect for a guy who went through her life without making a fuss or leaving her behind. That short marriage was over with a sigh. However, Randolph Scott's life after Marion DuPont was like a closed chapter written in quiet. It had no title, was full of mystery and rumors, and is still the subject of Hollywood whispers today. There are many kinds of bonds in Hollywood. Some people are in it for the attention, while others are in it for the money. Scott and Grant were not the same, though. They had pets, meals, trips, and lived together for 12 years. And sometimes long stretches of silence that were hard to explain. They first worked together in 1932 in the movie Hot Saturday. Grant, an English actor who had just moved to Hollywood, met Scott, a Southern cowboy who was still looking for his place. After shooting, they moved in together at a Malibu beach villa, which the press quickly called Bachelor Hall because it was home to 2 eligible men. It was during the 1930s that they were one of the most photographed real-life couples, not on TV. Together, they played golf, went camping, and just chilled out by the fire. A newspaper once printed a picture of them standing next to each other in the kitchen wearing similar embroidered aprons. It was such a close-up picture that it made everyone in Hollywood hold their breath. Howard Hawks, the director, once said, "They are the strangest and happiest couple I have ever met." Then the stories started. How did they treat each other? Best friends? Or lovers? In a time when being gay was seen as a sin, a threat to one's career, and the end of one's job as a star, even the slightest hint of sexual identity was a knife to the heart. Studios stepped in right away. They set up public relationships for both guys. Cary Grant married several women, but after each divorce, he moved back in with Scott. Hollywood didn't need the truth at the time, it needed a picture. Randolph Scott, who had been in battle before, was now stuck in a different kind of war. On one side was his partner, and on the other was the system that helped him build his career, and he was ready to destroy it if it took it. During all those years, they never said anything to be true or false. They didn't say why. They didn't answer. They were alive. Behind the villa's gate was a secret world where they might have found something they couldn't say out loud in public. But nothing stays the same forever. By 1944, the studio gave a choice. Cary Grant needs to get married. And Randolph Scott must too. Bachelor Hall was over. They went their different ways. So, a love or friendship ended because of a silence that had no other choice. But the link was never really broken. They sent each other Christmas cards and checked in with each other through friends they both had. Scott never once told the press about Cary Grant's name again in his whole life. However, he always kept a picture of the two of them in his own library. Then Cary Grant died in November 1986. After 2 months, on March 2, 1987, early in the morning, Randolph Scott also died peacefully in his Beverly Hills home. A family member said that when Scott heard that Grant had died, he hid his face in his hands and cried all afternoon by himself. No one knows if he was crying out of love, friendship, or the years he had kept quiet. There have been a lot of love and hate relationships in Hollywood. There are breakups and reconciliations, fights and reconciliations. But Randolph Scott and Cary Grant were the only ones who didn't say anything. Even now, almost 100 years later, that silence still makes people wonder, can love ever be fully lived if it's never allowed to exist in the open? In 1944, when Randolph Scott's career was at its peak and Hollywood gossip was spreading tales that wouldn't go away, he got married out of the blue. Patricia Stillman, a shy, little-known actor 13 years his junior who didn't leave much of an impression in the entertainment business, came into his life this time. No romantic love story was told, and the media didn't go crazy like they do with other A-list weddings. It was impossible not to be suspicious because everything happened too quickly, too easily, and too safely. Some old friends said that Scott didn't marry for love, but for peace. A place to live, a public image to keep up, and a decision made to end the questions that were still being asked. The more amazing fact was that they were married for 43 years. They lived together quietly, without any problems, breaks, or divorces. They lived in a home in Beverly Hills away from the public eye and adopted 2 kids, Christopher and Sandra. Scott stopped going on dates. He stopped going to parties and staying away from Hollywood. Instead, he focused on making movies and investing money. Some say he had really found peace, while others think it was just the last deal in a life that was never lived on one's own terms. Even after getting married and having kids, Scott never talked about his love life. When asked about his relationship with Cary Grant in the past, the few times he was interviewed, he gave short, vague answers. "I'm happy with my family. Now life is easy." Not a single love word. Not anything deep. The same could be said about Patricia Stillman. She kept to herself, rarely went out in public, never talked about her marriage, and never wrote a biography. And didn't go to any public events after Scott died. In 1987, at his funeral, she stood quietly next to the coffin while holding the hands of their 2 children. She didn't say a word to the press and only gave a small smile when someone brought up Cary Grant. Patricia may have known everything and still chose to stay with him as a friend rather than a lover. Love isn't always about having something, she may have realized. Sometimes it's about being there for a guy at the right time, in the right place, and in the right way to help him survive in a world where he was never allowed to be himself. There wasn't a famous love story behind the marriage to Patricia. It was the end of a life full of scars, contradictions, and silence. There was a man who was once called America's ideal cowboy. He spent the rest of his life in a house with no shooting or cheers. Only the peace and quiet he used to dream of when he stood in the deserts of the movie West. To end his career while still at the top, Randolph Scott quit acting in 1962. It wasn't because parts stopped coming his way, his time had run out, or his health was getting worse. People think that his last movie, Ride the High Country, is one of the last great westerns of the Golden Age. It was an unspoken but proud goodbye. After that, he was no longer seen in Hollywood. You won't see them in any interviews, parties, or cameos like many of your older friends. He left slowly, carefully, and without looking back, like a cowboy turning his back on town after a gunfight. It wasn't a poor or lonely life, though. Instead, he spent his last years in a kind of quiet wealth that not many people could have imagined. Not because of movies, but because they have good business sense. Beginning in the 1950s, Randolph Scott was investing in real estate while most of his friends were still playing or spending money. He bought important pieces of land in Palm Springs and the San Fernando Valley. He also joined the Cresta Verde Golf Club, which was one of the best places in California at the time. Over the next 20 years, those homes went up in value many times over. He also owned business property, owned shares in private investment firms, and kept up a secret but very useful financial network. Randolph Scott's projected net worth at the time of his death in 1987 was $100 million, which is about $280 million today. Even big stars like John Wayne and Steve McQueen respected this amount. But Scott never showed it off. There are no fancy cars or huge homes. No visits at places where the very rich like to hang out. He kept living in the same Beverly Hills home that Cary Grant stayed in the 1930s. It became the calm place where he raised his 2 adopted children for 40 years. Randolph Scott wasn't just rich in money, people often said. They also said he was rich in how he kept his private life from the glare of fame. A kind of comfort that a lot of Hollywood stars had lost. A long time ago. He didn't have to say goodbye because he never really came forward to meet the crowd. Instead, he just rode off and disappeared over the horizon. Randy Scott died of heart failure on March 2, 1987, when he was 89 years old. It was a quiet death, but it sent a small shockwave through the American film world. Not only because he was the last real horse movie star, but also because he died just 2 months after Cary Grant, the man he had been with his whole life. There wasn't a big funeral. There were only 25 people there, and Reverend Billy Graham, who was Scott's spiritual friend in his last years, led the quiet ceremony. During that quiet time, President Ronald Reagan sent a short message of sympathy to the family. There were no long speeches or memorials shown on TV. Just a farewell to a man who had been the perfect American guy for more than 30 years. Scott's name is on its own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. There is no one else like him in the Western Hall of Fame, which is a shrine to cowboy heroes. But behind all the fame, an odd thing was discovered in a wooden drawer at his home in Beverly Hills, a letter he had written but never sent. And no one named as the receiver. The letter had no subject or date and was written in smooth, even handwriting. However, every word read like a silent confession. It's been lonely for me my whole life. It's not that no one loved me, it's that I never let myself be loved in the right way. Cary Grant wasn't brought up. He didn't talk about being gay. He wasn't honest about anything. But people close to him and many of his longtime fans saw it as a pain that couldn't be named, a need to be pushed down all his life because the world wouldn't accept anything that wasn't the norm. I built a wall around myself with roles, image, and respect, but I didn't know that it was also locking me inside. The words didn't make me feel sorry for myself, but they were very clear and bitter. Especially when he wrote, if I had been born in another time, where people didn't have to hide who they love, I might not have taken this secret to the grave. His final line, scribbled more shakily than the rest, read, I blame no one. I only hope people understand that sometimes those who seem the strongest are the most alone. A lifetime, 89 years of living, nearly 100 films, a fortune of $100 million, a name engraved on the Walk of Fame. But perhaps the one thing Randolph Scott never truly had was a quiet afternoon spent beside the person he truly loved, without fear of the world watching. A man who spent his life playing the Western hero, but inside was in exile from his own emotions. For decades he rejected anything that might make his heart beat too wildly, just to preserve the reputation, the image, and the solemn dignity that America had assigned to him. So that the world might finally understand that behind the gun and the cowboy hat was a heart that had always been forced to remain silent. Randolph Scott was not just an actor. He was the final embodiment of the righteous cowboy archetype that audiences once believed in without question. Though he was famous, Randolph Scott never won an Oscar and was rarely honored at major award shows, but audiences didn't need a golden statue to validate him. With over 60 westerns, he helped define an entire genre. Scott wasn't the loud or arrogant kind of cowboy. He was the quiet hero, stern, steady, and never trembling when he drew his gun. The kind of character that became the blueprint for countless roles that followed. Randolph Scott never tried to impress his audience. He didn't chase the spotlight, nor did he leave behind any grand declarations. He was simply the man who rode through the cinematic West, never looking back, never saying goodbye, never voicing complaint. And yet, it was precisely that silence that made people keep thinking about him long after the dust had settled. His life was a closed-loop journey between public and private, between glory and hidden shadows no one could reach. On screen, he was a spotless cowboy icon. But behind him stood the walls he built to conceal a part of who he truly was. A marriage without love. A decades-long special friendship. A handwritten letter that was never revealed while he lived. He once ranked among the most beloved actors of the 1950s, but by the end of his life, he lived in a quiet mansion, avoiding media, refusing interviews, never writing a memoir. When he died, just 2 months after Cary Grant, his funeral had only 25 attendees, no fanfare, no noise. Yet even now, he is still regarded as Hollywood's last true cowboy from its golden age. Maybe it's because he never tried to become a legend that he became an irreplaceable part of American film memory. Not because of brutal shootouts, but because of calmness, because of that stern gaze, because behind the man with the gun was a weight he never fully spoke of. If you've ever watched Ride the High Country, if you've seen him and Joel McCrea riding off into the hills, you'll understand why that was his last film and the most beautiful farewell he ever gave to his audience. And what about you? Have you seen any of Randolph Scott's films? What do you feel about the man behind the Western hero image? What do you think allowed him to maintain such a pristine public image throughout his career? And what kept him from living his truth? Share your thoughts in the comments, because maybe in the end what someone like Randolph Scott longed for wasn't praise, it was understanding. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next compelling, mysterious story about the legends you love.